Morning everyone, I'm going to make a quick raw video today taking a look at forecasting sea conditions in a coastal environment. We're going to compare some online sources of information and then we're going to head out to the Trearddur Bay area on the west coast of Anglesey to compare our expectations with the reality of what's happening on that section of coastline. Anglesey is part of North Wales, which is in the UK on the northwest edge of Europe. We're at about 53 degrees north here and we're in a central position in the Irish Sea. We're exposed to a lot of low pressure systems that track over the United Kingdom from the North Atlantic Ocean, and so we could describe Anglesey as having a temperate maritime climate with plenty of exposure to strong winds from the west. Let's take a look at today's weather forecast. We've gone to the Wind Guru website. There are numerous other online sources available. This one's quite convenient for an overview of Anglesey conditions today. And we can see that overnight there's been a wind from the southwest of about 15 to 25 knots. In the early hours of Monday morning, that wind direction has changed to a westerly direction, and during the middle part of the day, the forecast wind direction is from the west-northwest, an average wind speed of 20 knots, gusting 30 plus. We can see that wave heights are very much driven by the wind direction. We've got up to 2.5 meter wave heights with a short wave period of 6 or 7 seconds, which is pretty common for the enclosed waters of the Irish Sea. We can also compare some other weather forecast sources. XC Weather, another online resource, is forecasting similar conditions. It's worth bearing in mind that the units of measurement are in miles per hour rather than knots, hence the different figures. And the pressure chart for the area shows that an occluded front has crossed the UK, and we can see from the angle of the isobars that we've got a west to northwest airstream forecast for this period of time. Let's also take a look at the tidal picture for today. Liverpool tides are forecast to be at around 2:15 in the afternoon. That's going to be low water at Liverpool, and we have a local time difference of 1.5 hours before Liverpool to give us high and low water values on the west coast of Anglesey. So simple conclusion is that local low water in the Trearddur Bay area is going to be at around 12:45 this afternoon. We're keeping the tidal picture really simple today. We're not interested in tidal streams, and we're going to go and explore some locations around Trearddur Bay that are relatively protected from tidal streams. So we're interested in wind-driven coastal sea conditions today. So a quick reminder of the Anglesey wind forecast for today. The overnight southwesterly wind has shifted in direction to a west-northwesterly direction, and during this part of the day we can expect 20 to 30 knots of wind. A sea state has developed overnight as a result of the previous southwesterly winds, and we've got fairly substantial wave heights of up to 2.5 meters with a short wave period of 6 or 7 seconds. We're going to go and explore a number of venues around the Trearddur Bay area, and we can see that the angle of the coastline is rather different according to which part of the bay we visit. So we'll go up to the north end of the bay between PORTH and PENRHYN, and we'll take a look at conditions along that south facing coastline. We'll also visit Trearddur Bay itself, a popular launch point, and then we'll consider the conditions along the coastline to the south of Trearddur Bay in the direction of Roscollin Head. This section points much more westerly, and so it should, in theory, have rather greater exposure to today's wind direction. Okay, I've come down to PORTH. This is location C on our map today. I'm at the north end of Trearddur Bay, and this is a popular launch point for sea kayak groups in many conditions. We've got partial protection from the west-northwesterly wind today. There's a bit of breeze blowing into the bay, which is only slightly exposed to the wind, and there's some small waves blowing in. It's probably a result of the southwesterly winds that we had
earlier in the night, and there's a bit of sea state out there, as you'll be able to see in a moment.
So here we're looking to the west out of the mouth of Porth Davach in the direction of PENRHYN, and we can see that conditions beyond the mouth of the bay are very paddleable. The waves against the headland aren't too great, and we know we've got some shelter from the wind direction. The launch from the beach is very manageable, just some small waves rolling in. It's quite narrow and rocky, so a bit of accuracy is needed, but it's very feasible to get out from this launch point.
Okay, so I've come down to the entrance to PORTH. This is location A on our map today. It's a south-facing inlet just to the east of the headland at PENRHYN, and you can see it's relatively flat water inside the bay. The west-northwesterly wind is blowing slightly offshore here, and last night's southwesterly winds are not creating too much sea state in the bay here. So it all looks very paddleable, quite easy to get in and out. But the key question that we have to answer is, what are the conditions like between Porth Davach and PORTH?
These shots demonstrate the conditions between Porth and Porth Davach along that south-facing coastline. We've got reasonable protection from the wind direction, and we can see that the underlying sea conditions are quite manageable. There's some energy at the base of the cliffs, but there's nothing too difficult to cope with. There is the remains of swell from the southwest from the previous night's wind, so it does require a little bit of caution around the rocks. But there's a very paddleable coastal corridor along this section of the coastline. We've got some protection from the wind direction. The west-northwest wind is blowing slightly offshore, and there's relatively protected sea state as a result of the cliff line at the north end of the bay. The conditions off the headland between Porth Davach and RHUFFYDD are very manageable. There's occasional breaking waves in the gap between the rock and the headland.
Interesting, it's all very paddleable. The underlying sea state is relatively protected as a result of the slight offshore wind. There's a southwesterly swell that's still prevalent from last night's wind, so it's making likely conditions afloat moderately challenging, but there's scope to get close into the cliffs, and you can see the landing behind me at Porth is very straightforward. Okay, so I've come down to the bay that's called PORTH, about halfway between Porth Davach and Trearddur Bay, and as you can see from the view behind me, it's much more exposed to the sea state down here. The angle of the coastline has changed a little. The bay faces southwest, and there's less protection from the more distant cliffs to the north. So the underlying sea state is rolling in here a lot more impressively. The back of the bay is calm, but getting out through the shallow rocks would be pretty tough. And the sea state, as you'll see from the footage, is impressively bigger along this section of coastline than on the first section that we looked at between Davach and RHUFFYDD.
Heading south from Porth Davach towards Trearddur Bay, the paddling conditions rapidly become much more challenging. There's greater exposure to the wind along this southwest facing coastline. There's less protection from the cliffs to the north, and the sea state develops quite rapidly. It's also a shallow area with a lot of exposed rock, and the bays at Porth are quite difficult to access in these conditions. It's a committing decision to thread a route through the narrow rocks. It's possible to follow an offshore route that stays clear of the hazards, There's deeper water out in the middle of the bay, but it's much more exposed to the wind direction. There's partial protection from the offlying reefs once you get to the bay areas just north of the inner bay, and it is possible to thread a route through those reefs with some local knowledge. But in a west-northwesterly wind, the shallow coastline along here makes for quite committing paddling.
So I've just taken a drive through Trearddur Bay from Porth Davach, stopping at Porth Post, and I've encountered much more exposed conditions down on this end of the bay, as the footage will show. The changing angle of the coastline and the increased fetch across the bay has permitted the waves to build up. There's much more exposure to the wind, and the onshore conditions are creating quite substantial waves breaking against the rocks here. So I've got some footage here at Porth Diana and in the inner bay at Trearddur. I'm going to carry on round to Ravens Point, and then finally we'll take a look at what's happening at Roscollin Head.
Here we can see the exposed conditions around the entrance to Porth Diana. It's much more exposed to the wind direction and the sea state that's built up as a result of the fetch across Trearddur Bay. There's a lot of shallow water amongst the rocky islands, breaking waves hitting an onshore coastline there. Pretty challenging paddling conditions. Out at Ravens Point, you've got full exposure to the conditions. There's relatively deep water off the headland, but there's a lot of reflected waves bouncing back, and you've got complete exposure to the wind in this area. All in all, it makes for very challenging conditions and much harder to imagine paddling safely in this environment when compared to the greater level of protection in the north of the bay between Porth Davach and PORTH.
Okay, so I've come down to the end of Ravens Point and we've moved on to a west-facing coastline here. And you can see clearly just how turbulent the sea is behind me. There's no shelter from the wind direction, and the coastline is much more exposed to the direction of the wind waves down here. There's very little tidal stream off the headland right now, and there's relatively deep water out there. So this is just the effect of short period waves breaking against the base of the cliffs, being driven onto the shore by about a 20-knot west-northwesterly wind. I don't think there's any need to go to Roscollin Head because we're going to find very similar conditions there. So we've seen a real development of conditions from the north side to the south side of the bay. I'm going to go home now and put all that footage into the computer and see if we can make a little video.
So in conclusion, we've taken a look at the available weather information for the Trearddur Bay area today. We've built up some expectations before heading over to that part of the island regarding the likely sea conditions, and we've given close attention to wind strength and wind direction. We've considered the history of the wind overnight before today, and we've also paid close attention to the angle of the coastline, the depth of the water, and the relative protection and exposure that different sections of the coastline have offered. Putting all that together, we've been able to compare actual conditions with the expectations we formed before we went out on the water. So it's a great exercise to do in your home waters. It begins with a forecast and then it continues with the collection of information and observation of conditions at your chosen paddling venue.